Hello everyone, welcome to my deck tech for my Classic Quarter League QT number 4 deck. This is a workshop deck, and right now the all workshop decks seem to be having a pretty good chance in the metagame these days, and one of the things that I wanted to make sure was that I would be able to qualify for the Invitational coming up in July. Seeing that I had a fairly poor record in the first 3 qualifier tournaments, I wanted to make sure that I would use a powerful deck to give myself the best chance to qualify. So with that, one of the things I wanted to do was obviously to try and use Mishra's Workshop to my advantage, but also recognizing that many of the players that will be participating in the qualifier tournament will probably also be piloting a workshop deck. They'll either be using a Metalworker workshop deck, which is a more traditional big robot type workshop deck that's been in the metagame since Mishra's Workshop was released with Masters Edition 4, but many people also are piloting perhaps the most powerful workshop deck, or at least fastest workshop deck, Affinity. One of the things that Affinity has an advantage of is that because it is faster than a traditional workshop deck, it is a little difficult for most workshop decks to be able to deal with. They usually run lots of creatures that are either free or close to free to pay for, and one of the things that they also have the advantage of capitalizing from is the interaction with Signal Pest excuse me, and Steel Overseer, as well as being able to use some of the traditional cards you would see in a regular workshop deck, like Lodestone Golem. So with that in mind, I did want to try and attack the deck. Also, Affinity uses Arcbound Ravager. It kind of abuses that card, which makes workshop decks, because there's no spot removal, makes workshop decks very difficult to manage that. So one of the things that, or one of the tools that workshop decks have to mitigate that is Null Rod. Null Rod turns almost all of their creatures into bears. Arcbound Ravager is just a 2/2. Steel Overseer is a 1/1. A lot of their other artifacts, which provide them some acceleration, like Springleaf Drum and Mox Opal, are also turned off by Null Rod. And clearly the biggest benefit here is that in this deck there are 10 lands that can cast Null Rod in turn 1, as well as 2 artifacts that can cast Null Rod on turn 1 with just 1 other land. And that's really where the crux of this deck lies. There are not as many Mana Accelerants. Sol Ring and Mana Crypt are basically the only 2. They are the most efficient in the sense that you can cast them on turn 1 to either help you cast the Null Rod or something else if Null Rod isn't in your hand, but you don't want to gum up your deck with too many artifacts as it contradicts with Null Rod. So one of the other things is Null Rod is limited in its scope. You don't need it against several decks, and in fact there's lots of decks out there that don't even care about Null Rod. So while you want to make sure you have, I wanted to make sure that I had access to Null Rod pre-board. 2 seemed like the perfect number. It's a tournament that I know going in who I'm playing against. I could potentially aggressively mulligan to find a Null Rod in game 1 if need be, and then I have access to a 3rd out of the board. So the rest of the deck is pretty similar. I do play a full play set of Phyrexian Revokers. They kind of act as sort of a spot removal, per se, um, as it can kind of stop a lot of things as a one, as in a one-shot type deal. So you can play that also in turn one and name Arcbound Ravager or something like that out of an affinity deck, and you can turn off lots of other things from other decks, Planeswalkers, and quite a few different other creatures that are out there. Maybe Knight of the Reliquary, so on and so forth. So it has multifaceted value, and it is sort of a null rod light in this deck. 7 spheres, 4 spheres of resistance, and 3 thorns. There's lots of creatures running around. That's why I don't have a full play set of thorns. Combo isn't necessarily a big problem, but playing a thorn into a creature deck, such as Hate Bears or something along those lines, is really suboptimal. So that's why I have 3, and the 3 of them can easily come out games 2 and 3 if I'm playing against a heavy creature deck. There's plenty of options that I have in my sideboard to bring in. Also, we have the Trinisphere, and that rounds out our sphere package with, of course, the 4 Lodestone Golems. Going to the 3-drop spot, there's a Singleton Crucible Worlds. Again, this is another card that if you can strip lock them out, it's nice, but having them in multiples doesn't do you any good. You can't play more than 1 land from your graveyard if you have 2 of them in play, and they simply don't do anything really without Wastelands and or a Strip Mine. It can recur Mishra's Factories and things like that late game, which comes in handy, but early on, you really don't want to have more than 1, which is why I have them 1 in the main deck. I want more access to them out of the sideboard against mirror matches and whatnot. But for the main deck, 1 is a perfect number. And here we also have a full complement of Tanglewire. It's just a perfect card to try and either lock a game up or come from to help come from behind. There's really not much to say about Tanglewire. It's a supremely powerful card, one that can be cast off a single workshop, and like I said, it allows you to catch up or lock the game down, depending on the timing that you use to play it. So it's a quite useful card, and has really changed the way Mishra's Workshop decks have interacted with the entire format. As I mentioned before, we have the full playset of Lodestone Golem. There's no reason to play anything less than 4. I have 3 Phyrexian Metamorphs. In the future, they're not going to have quite as much value since they cannot be used to legend rule out opposing Emeralds or Grizzlebrands. But for now, under the current or old rules, however you want to consider it, this is still a pretty good card. Again, this is something that it needs other artifacts to gain value, so I don't want to have a full playset of 4. 3 is a pretty good number, but at this point, like I said, its value is going to be diminished in the long term. I have a Singleton Precursor Golem, which is kind of interesting. It's a very powerful card for 5 mana. You can put down 9 power on the board, but unfortunately, the synergy with Lodestone Golem, if you have both of them out in play, someone can target the original Precursor Golem with something like a Lightning Bolt, and rid all 4 of them from the board. But it's a powerful card in the sense that because this deck doesn't have quite the amount of acceleration that many other workshop decks do. 5 mana is kind of critical. You can stall out and not be able to play a 6-drop until turn 4 in this deck because of the way the mana base is organized, whereas you can usually consistently cast the Precursor Golem off of 3 lands. So from that standpoint, it's also pretty good to clog up the board and catch up against other faster workshop decks, specifically Affinity. Moving to the 6-drop slot, again, this deck has to be a little bit more overpowering, simply because the low end of the curve is more of a prison aspect. So these are kind of your game-winning plays. Wormcoil Engine is just a perfect robot. It is can catch you up after you've had some attacks and life loss from either tapping your Ancient Tombs or losing a couple flips to Mana Crypt, or even casting a Phyrexian Metamorph costs a couple of life. So there's a lot of life that this deck loses, combined with the fact that your opponents will probably be chipping away at your life total. Wormcoil Engine is a great option. The fact that it has Death Touch is just nice. It pretty much will trade with anything in the format, but even if it does, it will leave behind 6 power of creatures as well. So again, I don't really want to have a full set of 4, simply because of the 6 mana cost. If anything, the Precursor Golem is kind of like Wormcoil Engine number 4. Steel Hellkite is another great card as a singleton. It's obviously not really easy to find it. There's no tutoring at all in this deck, but pre-board it's nice to have as far as options against certain things. Like Dredge, it's great. You can swing in and kill all of their tokens. Against Affinity, it's pretty good. A lot of their things are, 1 or 2 drops, and you can kind of wipe out several different things at the same time. And it's just overall, it's a pretty decent card, and it's a flyer as well, so it can stop a Trigon Predator, which is one of the banes of workshop decks. Also, we have a singleton duplicant that, going forward, will probably be a little bit more important than Metamorph is to get rid of Oathed Up creatures because of the new legend rule. But for the time being, while it serves that purpose, again, as a 6-drop, you really don't want to have too many. And because the format doesn't have a significant amount of combo decks, I only have 3 Chalices. Really, especially since we don't have to cast Chalice on 0 because of the lack of Moxen in the format. Chalice of the Void is usually set at either 1 or 2 counters. I have rarely ever cast it with anything more than 2 counters, but you can in a pinch. But because you're usually setting it to 1 or 2 different numbers, drawing it in multiples isn't necessarily advantageous. So that's why I have 3, but it gives me space to put in some of the other things in this deck. So going to the sideboard, there's a couple extra Crucible Worlds. Again, those are mostly for mirror matches where you would take out things like Sphere of Resistance and Chalice of the Void. So those cards do almost nothing in the mirror match, so you really want to bring in as many cards as possible that you can potentially use to your advantage against an opponent. So having access to Crucible Worlds is pretty decent. It also helps prevent difficulties with mana with decks that are packing Wastelands as well at post-board. I got an extra duplicate. Again, this is for Oath matches and the mirror match as well. Also for Oath, we have a full play set of Grafdigger's Cage. These are just nice since they can be cast on turn 1 as an artifact. It's not a problem to cast it in this deck reliably, and you can even cast more than 1 if you draw one on your opening hand. Draw more than 1 in your opening hand sometimes. But it's mostly a nod to Oath. unfortunately, its ability for shutting off Oath is somewhat limited. It more or less buys you some turns because of the omnipresence of Abrupt Decay. No longer can you set a Chalice at 2 or 1 and protect your Grafdigger's Cage after that, because Abrupt Decay will run right through it, won't have a problem. So while there's 4 Grafdigger's Cage here, for against the Oath matchups, I also have 2 Witchbane Orb, which are a lot more difficult for them to get rid of. At 4 mana, Abrupt Decay doesn't do anything, and generally speaking, they're probably only going to have a Nature's Claim to get rid of it. Ancient Grudge isn't as popular of a card these days, so setting a Chalice at 1 and playing a Witchbane Orb is probably going to lock the game up in your favor. For the Dredge matchup, we got a full play set of Lead Line of the Void. It's quite, it's definitely the best card against graveyard strategies. It's impossible to cast, unfortunately, so you have to mulligan to find it. But when you do have it, it is quite possibly the best card, since you can cast it or put it into play before your opponent gets a chance to go. So that's the advantage of Lead Line over other options. Like I said, I have the 3rd Null Rod out of the board so that we can interact with the other Workshop and Artifact decks. I've got an extra Steel Huckite. Again, this is for the mirror match, just throwing as many creatures as we can into the main deck from the sideboard. And that is it. It's a pretty straightforward deck. There's not a whole lot of interaction. The idea is to put down lock pieces and then take over the game in the mid to late stage, as opposed to some of the faster Workshop decks that aim to win within the first couple of turns. So this is the deck. Hopefully I will perform a little bit better than I have in the past, and I just want to thank you for watching.